All right, in this lesson, we're going to look at distinguishing between total GDP and gross national income and per capita GDP and per capita national income. And we're also going to take a look at why we use these national income statistics and what are their shortcomings. But first, before we get to that, I wanted to go back and make one more point about this real versus nominal and why looking at the real value is so much more important than looking at the nominal. So let's say that you live on an island. This is you. All right, you live on this island, and you make, here's a tree, and you make birdhouses. Okay, that's the only thing that you make, and you're the only person on this island. So what we're doing is looking at the GDP for a country, and that is a country of you. All right, and you are the birdhouse maker. Put a hole here so I can get inside of it. And so let's say that you made these birdhouses and you sold each of them for $30. All right, when we get the GDP figure, all we do is, remember, it's the total dollar value of what we produce, and so we produce 4 of them, sell them at $30 each, and so our GDP, and we'll call this nominal because it's just the dollar value of it at the time, and so the nominal GDP here would be $120. All right, because we got 4 at $30. So let's say that this is year 1. So let's say that in year 2, you're still in business making birdhouses, and you make 4 of them again. All right, get the holes so they can go in. And let's say that now, instead of selling them at $30, you sell them for $40 a piece. And so here's the nominal GDP. Again, it's the total dollar value of all the goods and services that are produced. And so you're this island of one. This is your total production. And so you would say that you have a GDP of 160. Now, if you look at this, this would appear that your GDP is going up and your nominal GDP is. But remember, if we go back to this other page, real GDP measures output. All right, that's what that number is going to tell us. And so if we go back over here, is it misleading? Is this number misleading at all, going from 120 to 160? Does this make it look like we're increasing our output? And it does. But really, the only thing that's happened is that we've had inflation from one year to the next. And so when we do real GDP, remember, we're putting everything in 1 year's prices. And so we're going to pretend that this is the year that we'll use. All right. And so our real GDP, and so this would be the price that we would use. So our real GDP in the first year, in year 1, would be $120. Then when we do the real GDP in year 2, we've got 4 of these again, so we produce 4 of them, and we have to use the prices of the year that we're looking at. And so this is what they call the base year, and we'll get into that later. But so the real GDP here would be $120. And so then you can say, you know what, now we can compare these 2 quarters, and you can see that output stayed the same. Okay, the only thing that happened here was inflation. And so if you're just looking at nominal GDP numbers from year to year to year, you can't compare because it might be all inflation and no true increase in output, or it might be all of an increase in output and no inflation, or some combination of the two. But when you put it in terms of real GDP, then you can say, okay, we can compare years 1 and 2. Let's say that we go to year 3 and you produced, let's say lots of birds came in and you produced 6 of these and you sold them at $50 a piece. All right, and so what would the nominal GDP be here? So I'm going to let you figure that out while I put the holes in. So the nominal GDP would be the 50 times the number of birdhouses, that's 6. And so the nominal GDP would be 300. And now you're saying, wow, we've gone from 120 all the way up to 300 in just 2 years. We are really doing good. It would appear that our output has almost tripled. But if we do real GDP, we would take these 6 houses and pretend that we sold them in this year, the base year, going back to 30. And so our real GDP would be this 30 times the 6 houses, which is 180. Okay? And so then we can look at year 1 or year 2 and say, have we had economic growth going into year 3? And then we can look at this real GDP number and say, yeah, because we've gone from 120 to 180 and we're holding the inflation rate steady. Okay, we're adjusting for inflation and just pretending that everything is produced in 1 year using that dollar's values. All right, so just want to make that point. Let's go to this next one. distinguish between total GDP, which is what we're looking at, and per capita. And per capita simply means per person. All right. And so to find the per capita GDP, all you do is take we'll do real GDP divided by the population. All right. And so let's say that we have a country in which the real GDP is $1,000, and let's say there's 10 people living in the country, not $10, 10 people living in the country, and so we would say that the per capita GDP would be $100 per person. Okay. Now, there are a lot of limitations to using this, but it does help somewhat in looking at a country and saying, okay, how wealthy are they? Doesn't mean that this doesn't mean that everybody earns $100, but this just puts it on a per person basis. So let's look at some actual numbers to see why per capita and total can give you two very different appearing scenarios. So let's go to here's our Wikipedia page, and I've pulled up total GDP. Okay, so country's total GDP. So here's the U.S. This is back in 2011, so last year. The U.S.'s total GDP was a little over $15 trillion. All right, followed by China at 11.3 trillion, followed by India at almost 4.5 trillion. All right, so the top three total GDP numbers for U.S., China, and India. I think Japan, Germany, Russia, Brazil, UK. So let me scroll down so you can kind of see, just give you an idea if you're looking for any specific countries. So the old Turkey is at 1 trillion, then everybody else is in the billions. Iran's 990 billion, and we can keep going down. Let's scroll all the way to the bottom, just see what's there. So we've got Syria not available, Sao Tome and Principe, 379, that would be million. All right, and so anyway, so here's the totals. And so you look at it and say, wow, it appears that everybody in the U.S. and China and India are probably some of the wealthier people, and you can see that definitely in the U.S. and China, you would say, you know what, these seem like they're pretty comparable, and same with India and Japan. But you know intuitively that the living standards of the average person in the U.S. and the average person in China are a little bit different. Same for India and Japan, even though their total GDP is similar. So what we want to do is look at the per capita. All right, and so remember, we're taking the total GDP, dividing it by the population. So when we do this, the U.S. is no longer number one. Qatar, which is in the Middle East, they are at number one, $102,000, $103,000 per person. They get this from a lot of oil wealth and a lower population. Luxembourg, Singapore. So you can see the U.S. comes in at $48,387. So that looks pretty good for us. Now the question is, where is China and India? Because remember, they were the two economies that were behind us, especially China, which was relatively close. And so you can see we're at 48,000. United Arab Emirates. You can see some of the oil countries in here: Brunei, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. I'm sure Saudi Arabia is here somewhere. But anyway, so here's all the per capitas. Here's the UK down here. And so let's just scroll down until we can see the European Union has a $31,000. There's Israel, the Bahamas, Spain. And so we can keep going down. And we still haven't seen China yet. And you should be able to say that's because even though they have somewhere around $11 trillion in GDP, they have something like 1.4 billion people. And so when you divide that out per person, that number gets a lot lower. And so there we go. There's China at number 9, ranked 92nd at $8,382. So that would be like somebody here living off $8,382. These are calculated in what they call purchase power parity. So it kind of puts the same. Well, we'll get into that later. So this is China at 8,000. We still haven't seen India. And again, India's got a population of right around 1 billion. And so we can keep coming down. Jordan, Libya, Georgia. I forget where India was. I think, oh, there we go. So here's India at $3,694. So it's the third biggest economy in the world, but when you break it down per person, they rank 129th. So you can see that it's good to see the per capita because that gives you some insight. Not a lot, because there's a lot of other statistics you'd want to look at, but it gives you some insight into uh, kind of how wealthy they are. All right, but it doesn't give us anything with income distribution, but we'll get into that shortly. So this is just the difference between total and per capita. All right. Now the last thing that I wanted to do is evaluate the use of national income statistics. All right. Uh, and so what we want to do first is look at uh, we want to look at the economic goals of a nation because the statistics are going to be helpful in trying to help us meet those goals. So the first goal that nations have generally is economic growth. And we measure that through GDP. And do you think that's real or nominal? All right, sorry about the cough again. I tried to hold it farther away so it wouldn't blast everybody's ears. So economic growth is measured in real GDP. Another goal that countries have would be price stability, and that is inflation. Uh, and we measure that in the U.S. with CPI. The third economic goal would be full employment, and that doesn't imply zero unemployment. Remember, it refers to the natural rate. In the U.S., it's somewhere between 4 and 5%. That number may be changing after this recession, and that's a discussion for later. Another one is external stability, and that is you don't want a huge trade imbalance, either a huge trade surplus or a huge trade deficit. So this deals with exports and imports. Imports are denoted with an M, exports with an X. And then finally you want some form of an equitable distribution of income distribution. All right, you don't want one person having all the wealth and everybody else having nothing. At the same time, you don't want to guarantee that everybody has the exact same amount. Neither of those are good. Where you fall in between, that's a debatable topic that we'll get into later. So these are our economic goals. So we want to look at GDP and say, how does GDP help us here? All right. And so the first thing is it helps us figure out if it helps us determine whether the national objective of economic growth is happening. So allows us to measure economic growth. All right, and so at this point you should be kind of saying the so what. Are we achieving economic growth? And so why is this important to know if we are or not? And that's because a lot of politicians and economists will use these statistics, or you at least hope they do, to write policy. Use statistics for writing economic policy. All right? And so if we get these numbers right and economic growth is our goal, then we can tweak laws or taxes or whatever it is to get us to our goal of economic growth. The third thing is that it allows economists to create models of the economy, and that in turn allows them to forecast what's going on in the economy. And forecasting is a big deal. If you're making decisions now, in terms of investments or taxation, whatever, you need to know some idea of what's going on, what people anticipate to happen to the economy in the future. And so it is very important for that. And if you're a business leader, imagine you are BMW and you have the factory in Spartanburg. If they're calling for a global recession, what are you going to plan on doing? You're going to plan on probably cutting back some of your production. But if all the economists around the world are saying this is going to be a huge boom, everybody's going to become wealthy, then you're probably going to increase your production, make business decisions now, so you'll be ready for that increase in the future. So used to make business decisions. All right. Oops, decisions. All right, that says decisions. Let's see, the fifth one is that it allows you to track the economy over time. All right, and so that way you can see if, again, if the policies that you've implemented are working. Do you need to tweak things or not? Track the economy over time. And remember, which GDP figure do we use for tracking over time? Is it real or is it nominal GDP? Okay, and hopefully you said real because that allows us to compare values from one time to the other. Two more. The sixth thing is that it gives us some indication, not a lot, but some, let's just say modest indication of a country's standard of living. And I say modest because we don't know what the income distribution's like. Like if we go back to gutter here at $102,000, that doesn't mean that everybody on average has $102,000. There might be 4 or 5 individuals that have 80% of the wealth, and then the rest of the population has 20% that they have to split between them. And so the average person may be kind of poor. I just don't know. But so it's not a great measure. We would assume that gutter probably has a better living standard based on their per capita GDP than somebody in Guinea or Afghanistan or Madagascar. And so that's why I say it's a modest indication of standard of living, but there's a lot of other variables that we'll look at. And finally, the last one, just like we did, it can be used to compare countries. Okay? And so just in this lesson here, that's how we've used it to look at these different countries and say, okay, how do we compare? How does the economy of the United States per capita compare to Switzerland? Or we can go over here to the totals and say, who's got the biggest economy in the world? You know, but anyway, allows us to compare. So that'll be it for this one. In the next video, we'll look at the limitations of GDP because there are a fair number and it's important to know the distinction. So until then.